Good afternoon. My name is Uta Peuge, and I'm the Dean of the College of Social Sciences and Humanities at Northeastern. It is a privilege to say a few words on the occasion of the final event of the year-long Asia, America, and the World series, a series of conversations organized by Philip Tai together with other colleagues for Northeastern's Global Campus Network. I want to thank Professor Tai and the students and colleagues who have pushed for more learning on the complex histories of Asian Americans and learning on the intertwining of these histories with histories of racism, empire, labor, migration, activism, and also the state. It is a special pleasure to say a few words at the occasion of Professor Moon-Ho Jung's conversation with all of us here this afternoon. Professor Jung and I were close colleagues for a number of years at the University of Washington, where we shared meals as well as notes on many matters, from departmental politics to raising little girls in Seattle. As I was searching my computer today, I was finding peer evaluations that we wrote of visits to each other's classrooms in the 2000s, each of us deeply interested in understanding with our students the complexities and histories of the categories of race and gender. I'm absolutely thrilled that today we will learn from Professor Jung about his latest book that connects the history of American involvement in the Pacific and resistance to that involvement with the development of the US security state. In his teaching, as well as in his research and in his writing for broader audiences, Professor Moon has always shown an amazing ability to make the history of Asians in North America central to broader histories and broader narratives. He did pioneering work showing the history of Chinese migration to the American South and how that was intertwined with the history of slavery, sugar production, and racism. He is now rewriting the history of US empire and the US state with the Pacific and with Asians and Asian Americans at the center. And he always shows us that Asian American is not and never has been a monolithic category. We are in for an intellectual challenge and an intellectual treat today. Without further ado, let me turn to Professor Tai.
Very much, Dean Peuger. Hello, everyone. I am Philip Tai, Director of the Northeastern University Asian Studies Program and Associate Professor of History and Asian Studies. It is my pleasure to welcome everyone to our speaker series, Asia, America, and the World. And we are very honored to present our sixth and final event today, featuring Professor Moon-Ho Jung. Our event today will offer a fitting conclusion to our speaker series, because today's presentation by Professor Moon is going to provide an important backdrop to understanding Asian American history within a larger global context. He's going to trace how the virulence of anti-Asian racism, how the suppression of anti-colonial revolutionary movements animated US foreign policy in the Pacific during the early 20th century, and how they laid at the heart of the national security state and the American empire that endured to this very day. So his talk is firmly grounded in the same theme of the series, Asia, America, and the World. We are looking forward to Professor Moon's presentation, but before I yield the floor, I want to offer my final thanks to the support of many institutions and individuals here at Northeastern. A year ago, this speaker series existed as a proposal, as an idea, in a series of informal conversations. Once Northeastern publicized it and made it a public centerpiece in its response to student demands for more Asian American studies on campus, we scrambled to organize a series to enlist the speakers and iron out the logistics. It was all very difficult, but we were very, very fortunate to have the assistance of so many people, so many institutions. So once again, I want to acknowledge the support of the Office of the Provost and the College of Social Sciences and Humanities for their sponsorship, the Humanities Center for its co-sponsorship. I want to acknowledge people like Senior Vice Provost Phil He, Chief Inclusion Officer Carl Reed, and Dean Uta Peuger for their ongoing support. And I also want to recognize the many people who did the hard work to make these events possible. Our Asian Studies program team, Mika Morikawa Joe, Ezra Acevedo, Krishna Singh, Jen Grieve in the CSSH Dean's office for the logistics, the marketing and communications team of Mike Farah and Najima Hollis Huggins, Rachel Mu and her staff at the Asia America Center, Team 442, and other Northeastern student leaders and organizations whose original demand made this speaker series and many other changes at Northeastern possible. So thank you all very much. Without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speakers today. Our moderator is Eun-Sung Kim, Assistant Professor of English at Northeastern University. Her research and teaching specialties include poetry, translation, visual culture, and critical race and ethnic studies. She is the author of the forthcoming book, The Politics of Collecting, Property and Race in Aesthetic Formation, as well as the poetry collection, Gospel of Regicide. Her research has been supported by numerous fellowships and grants, including the Ford Foundation Fellowship, Yale University Poynter Fellowship, and the Andy Warhol Art Writers Program. We are also very honored that Professor Kim has agreed to moderate our final speakers event. Our speaker is Moonho Jung, who is D.O. Richardson Professor of History at the University of Washington. He is a scholar of modern US history with research and teaching specialties in race, politics, Asian American history, and comparative ethnicity and nationalism. He is the author of numerous publications, including the award-winning Coolies and Cane, Race, Labor, and Sugar in the Age of Emancipation, and his latest book and the subject of today's presentation, Menace to Empire, Anticolonial Solidarities, and the Transpacific Origins of the US Security State. We are very honored that Professor Moon will wrap up our speaker series. I will invite Professor Kim to offer a few words to help frame this discussion. She will then invite Professor Moon to give his presentation. Afterwards, Professor Kim will moderate the discussion between the speaker and the audience. The audience is more than welcome to submit their questions in the chat box. Finally, I want to encourage the audience to stay until the very end. We will announce details regarding a raffle to win copies of Professor Moon's new book, so please don't miss out. Thank you again for your time, and here, Professor Kim, I will hand it off to you.
Thanks, Philip, for your introduction. And yes, we are so excited to have Moonho Jung with us today. So before I hand it over, I just wanted to acknowledge where we're currently at by stating that Boston is the homeland of the Massachusetts and their neighbors, the Wampanoag and Nipmuc people. This is their territory, and the fight against global settler colonialism is ongoing. To name the land without substance is without substance until it's made material. Following Eve Tuck and Wayne Yang, the naming of land must come with the lifelong promise to fight for repatriation. The repatriation of land, water, institutions, language. Otherwise, it becomes an abstraction, a verbal note void of substance. Lastly, and this is something that me and my students have been really thinking about, it's important to state that we're still and currently in the middle of a global pandemic where harms and risks have been unevenly distributed to racialized, indigenous, and poor communities. And white supremacists and anti-Black violence have been relentless all around the world. This is the context in which we speak, learn, think, research, and write from today. As Professor Tai mentioned, on March 2nd of 2021, the Asian American community, a group of Asian American students at Northeastern, in conjunction with student groups such as the Asian American Students in Action, the Vietnamese Student Association, and the Society of Asian Scientists and Engineers, published an open letter to Northeastern University, stating, quote, and this is their language, "While the few hate crimes publicized by the media bring anti-Asian racism to light, they by no means encompass the centuries of imperialism, colonialism. This imperialism and colonialism, found both in Asia and in employment-based immigration policies here at home, have brought about the commodification of Asian minds, bodies, and labor," end quote. Articulating the continuum of contemporary racialized violence with the history of US imperialism, the AAC demanded that the university make good on its public-facing claims for racial justice by increasing funding for Asian American student activities, hiring tenure-track faculty in order to start an Asian American Studies program, and rejected increased policing as an answer to historical, structural, ongoing colonial violence. Stating in bold, they wrote, quote, "We do not want increased police presence on campus. We cannot in good conscience advocate for an action they may harm others in order to protect ourselves. We do not want to threaten the work being done by our Black peers. Any nuance in policing should be directed to our peers at Black at NU, end quote. The students at Northeastern take part in the history of Asian American activism, where their uncompensated labor and critique redefine the possibilities of the university. They remind us that Asian American, Black, Native, and ethnic studies programs are made through radical student activism. These programs would not exist without their labor at Northeastern and elsewhere. These programs are not given by the university, they are fought for and won by students. Muno Jung's Menace to Empire historicizes the imperial violence gestured to in the AAC open letter and contextualizes the student activism witnessed at Northeastern. Pairing forms of knowledge yet to be juxtaposed, such as radical European anarchist philosophy and Asian anti-colonial movements, Jung's text takes us through an archive of transnational connections, from Spanish anarchists to Filipino anti-colonial leaders, to the reverberating critiques made in Harlem and Hawaii, to situate the reactive, ideologically weak positioning of US imperialism. This excavation is of use in untangling the ways in which radical critiques of the state have been and remain racialized. Building upon the research done in the field around Asian exclusion acts, Jung demonstrates how the US nation state fortified these racialized laws to exclude those deemed ideologically radical, i.e. those who had a critique of the US nation state, such as Eastern European anarchists. In this way, Jung's research allows us to see how racialization and radicalization, though not customarily thought of together, become twin forces in the US legal imaginary, materializing to this date into state policy. The questions raised by Jung further cements the critique scholars such as Lisa Lowe has made of liberalism. Menace to Empire exposes how Asian subjects throughout the 20th and 21st century were assumed as seditious, irrespective of individual political subscription, exposing how the promise of liberalism and individual freedom is at fundamental odds with US empire, which remains. True freedom would require a rupture of these foundations. Lastly, as many of the students at Northeastern already understand, Jung's scholarship moves against the institutional siloing of racialized groups. Menace to Empire moves through frameworks such as how does the US deploy imperial violence in the name of democracy, and what is the relationship between liberal democracy and imperialism through an intimate embeddedness of Asian, Black, Indigenous, and radical stories, histories, and dreams. We are so excited to have Muno Jung here with us today. So I turn it over to you.
Wow, thank you for that introduction. I almost feel as though I don't need to give my talk after that introduction. Thank you, Philip, thank you, Uta, and thank you all for joining me virtually today. You know, when I finished writing this book early last year, I thought, you know, the timing was good because the pandemic would surely be over by 2022, but alas. But thank you for joining me today. And I'd also like to thank Mika Morikawa for directing the online show. All right, I'm gonna keep taking my glasses off because I need bifocals, but I am resisting getting them, all right? All right, exactly 1 year before his assassination, to the day, and actually to the hour, as Jack Odell, the longtime Black activist, used to point out, on April 4th, 1967, Martin Luther King broke his public silence on the Vietnam War. In that remarkable speech, King identified the US government as, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. And the US state remains the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today. So as we hear about the horrific acts of anti-Asian violence over the last 2 years, I want to remind us of that broader historical context. That is, there has been no greater force in carrying out anti-Asian violence more than the US state, which has been responsible for the killing of millions of Asian peoples, from the Philippine American War to World War II to the Korean War, Vietnam War, and beyond. In that violent context, Asian American activist Alex Singh articulated the rage that he and many others around the world were feeling. He wrote in 1970, "We are Asians," and I'm quoting, "We are Asians and as such identify ourselves with the baddest motherfuckers alive." You can bleep that out later, right? Yeah. All right, I'm quoting, "We can no longer be a witness to the daily slaughter of our people in Asia, nor to the oppression of the Asians here in America, and be afraid of death or prison. We must fight because that's what Asians are all about." In a nutshell, my book, Menace to Empire, is about tracing the historical dynamics and dialectics between those two forces over the first 4 decades of the 20th century. That is the racial and colonial violence carried out by the US empire and the anti-colonial rage that generated and mobilized radical movements across the Pacific. Carlos Bulosan, the Filipino writer and activist, understood those dynamics, those dialectics well. When the FBI marked Bulosan as a target of its investigation in 1950, the Seattle office of the FBI was interested in his labor organizing locally and his leftist affiliations. But the FBI became really alarmed when its agents discovered that he had ties to the communist movement in the Philippines. A Seattle agent informed J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, that Bulosan might have been working with Luis Taruc, whom the agent described as the leader of the Communist Party in the Philippine Islands. The FBI office, claimed to have information to suggest that a communist revolution was about to erupt in the Philippines in 1951, and that Bulosan had plans to send Filipino labor leaders from Seattle to the Philippines to join that revolution. In the meantime, the FBI office in San Francisco pored over its files to find all previous references to Bulosan. An agent there reported that the earliest reference was from 1943 in a report on, quote, suspected members of the Sactalista, a Filipino labor organization then believed to be pro-Japanese. An investigation into Bulosan's labor organizing in Seattle quickly became a matter of revolution and sedition across the Pacific. Over the next 40 minutes or so, I'd like to trace the Trans-Pacific roots behind Bulosan's radicalism and the US state's anti-radicalism. That the FBI saw connections between Bulosan's labor activism, his potentially pro-Japanese views, and ties to labor and communist movements in the Philippines, and that all of those activities constituted threats to US national security made sense. It made sense within Trans-Pacific context. And that's because for decades after the Philippine-American War, the US state's repeated articulation and narration of threats posed by radical anti-colonial movements created new conditions of possibility for the US state. During Bulosan's lifetime, and long before and long after, the US state cast anyone and everyone challenging US imperial claims to sovereignty as seditious enemies. That is the logic and legacy that Bulosan inherited in his struggle to advance democracy and racial justice across the Pacific, and in his confrontation with a state driven to repress anyone who dared to imagine a world beyond the bounds of the US empire. More broadly, I mean to suggest that we need to move beyond liberal framings of Filipinos, Asian Americans in general, other racialized subjects of the US empire as loyal Americans, somehow deserving or striving for recognition by an inclusion in the US nation state. Instead, we need to try to figure out how Bulusan and others forged a collective sense of belonging beyond and against the US state in long-standing struggles that defined and challenged the US empire. So about a decade before Bulusan's birth, President Theodore Roosevelt proclaimed the formal end to the Philippine-American War on July 4th, 1902. But developments on the ground belied US claims to victory and sovereignty. A month earlier, a massive wave of labor strikes had rocked the Philippines. Although the strikes were largely uncoordinated walkouts by aggrieved workers in different locales and industries, there was no question that the formation of the very first Filipino Labor Federation had ignited the spark. The Democratic Union of Workers, or the UOD, immediately attracted masses of Filipino workers by the summer of 1902. The idea of organizing Filipino workers was the brainchild of Isabelo de los Reyes, UOD's founding president and a prominent figure in the Philippine left. Now, de los Reyes had been a respected newspaper writer and owner in 1897 when his criticisms of the Spanish Empire led to his arrest and eventual deportation to Spain. His incarceration in a Barcelona prison, notorious for its torture chambers, opened de los Reyes' eyes to new radical possibilities. It was in that prison that he learned about anarchism as a political philosophy from fellow prisoners. Anarchism, he said, was about, quote, the abolition of boundaries, with all of us associating together without any need of fraudulent laws or ordinances which trap the unfortunate but leave the real criminals untouched. After his release from prison in 1898, de los Reyes began publishing a newspaper titled The Philippines Before Europe. During the Philippine-American War, he began publishing that paper with the motto, against North America? No. Against imperialism? Yes, until death. In 1901, still in the middle of the Philippine-American War, he decided to return to the Philippines to put his lessons on anarchism into practice. And US officials were ready. They struck back hard. From the moment de los Reyes returned home, they tried to stifle his activities, forbidding him to publish a newspaper or to form an independent political party. And he was criminalized as seditious, made possible by the Sedition Act, which was decreed by the US colonial regime in the Philippines in 1901. The Sedition Act of 1901 prohibited, quote, any person to advocate orally or by writing or printing or by like methods the independence of the Philippine Islands or their separation from the United States, either by peaceful or forcible means. So any kind of anti-colonial activity, expression was deemed seditious. Now, once the labor strikes began in 1902, de los Reyes was deemed seditious and arrested and sentenced to 4 months in prison. When Governor General William Howard Taft pardoned de los Reyes in 1903, he used that occasion to denounce de los Reyes, quote, as a born agitator, entirely irresponsible, who has striven to subvert this government, unquote. And for years to come, the US state monitored the movements and activities of anti-colonial Filipino revolutionaries like De Los Reyes, casting them as seditious and revolutionary, which in the eyes of US officials were the one and the same. The suppression of the UOD hardly spelled the end of US imperial insecurities. And you know, we just need to remember that Asia, most of Asia was colonized. And the colonization of Asia happened at the same time as the colonization of the Americas. And in the wake of Japan's victory in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, anti-colonial activists across colonized Asia looked to Japan as a potential source of inspiration. In the Philippines, the specter of Japanese intervention against the United States sparked new hopes for a new Philippine revolution. And no one exemplified the persistence of the Philippine Revolution and its potential alliance with Imperial Japan more than Artemio Ricarte. He was part of the Philippine Revolution. He took up arms against the Spanish Empire in 1896, and he grew very wary of US designs in the Philippines, and he soon took up arms against the US Empire. And he was eventually captured by US troops in the summer of 1900. But he flatly refused to pledge allegiance to the Stars and Stripes, for which he was deported to Guam, another former Spanish colony claimed by the US Empire to this day. In 1903, when he was taken back to the Philippines from Guam, Ricarte again refused to take an oath to the United States. US authorities then banished him to Hong Kong, where he continued to organize for Philippine independence. And he began to argue that an imminent war between the United States and Japan, or an imminent war between Japan and Russia, might produce political conditions favorable to a revolution in the Philippines. So this was on the eve of the Russo-Japanese War. Ricarte secretly returned to the Philippines at the end of 1903 and taunted those who thought that the US Empire would afford an improvement over the Spanish Empire. Ricarte wrote in Manila's newspapers, "Where is the boasted right of assembly, the freedom of the press, and the liberty of speech?" The Philippine Constabulary, a civilian police force established by the US colonial regime in 1901, fixated on capturing Ricarte. The Constabulary, led by US Army officers and manned on the ground by Filipino recruits, was leading the effort to pacify the Philippines, that is, to colonize the Philippines. And the Constabulary grew especially alarmed in 1907 because Ricarte's activities appeared to be part of a wider conflict emerging between Japan and the United States. Now, formally, Japan and the United States had reached diplomatic agreements to respect each other's colonial claims. That agreement was reached in 1905. US agreed to honor Japan's claims over Korea, and in return, Japan agreed to honor US claims over the Philippines. But that agreement hardly relieved the US state's growing alarm over Japan's imperial ambitions. So President Theodore Roosevelt believed, quote, "Japan was a great civilized power of a formidable type, but with motives and ways of thought which are not quite those of the powers of our own race." So during the Russo-Japanese War, Roosevelt pondered Japan's racial motivations. He wrote privately, quote, "I have no doubt that they include all white men as being people who, as a whole, they dislike, the Japanese dislike, and whose past arrogance they resent. And doubtless they believe their own yellow civilization to be better. Japan is an Oriental nation, and the individual standard of truthfulness in Japan is low," Roosevelt wrote. To Roosevelt, Japan loomed large as a civilized and Oriental threat to white supremacy. And as racial tensions between the United States and Japan mounted in 1906 and 1907, especially over San Francisco's segregation of Japanese students into the Oriental School, many American newspapers began forecasting an imminent war between Japan and the United States. And it was at that point that the Roosevelt administration prepared for its first Trans-Pacific War plan on how US forces would fight Japan. And I'm talking about Theodore Roosevelt, not Franklin Roosevelt. Now, news of an impending war between Japan and the United States took on a revolutionary character in and through the Philippines. Almost immediately upon the conclusion of the Russo-Japanese War, the Filipinos struggling for independence began sharing stories of a wider conflict in Asia that might provide an opportunity to challenge US claims over the Philippines. By the beginning of 1907, the growing resentment against US colonial rule and rising faith in Japan's potential assistance had become interconnected, at least in the minds of US officials. So a constabulary official wrote to the US ambassador to Japan, quote, "Superficially, everything is in a fairly quiet condition, but there is a very strong and nasty undercurrent. The people all over are convinced that there will soon be war with Japan, and wild-eyed rumors of all kinds are flying about as to its effect upon this country," unquote. As Filipino radicals became infatuated with the possibility of working with Japan, US military and constabulary officers came to fixate on what they increasingly saw as a growing pan-Asian threat to the US empire. Harry Bandholz, the head of the constabulary, admitted, quote, "At heart, all of the Filipinos desire their independence," unquote. He admitted that. But he did not think that desire explained the upsurge of anti-American activities. Instead, he blamed Japan. He blamed the Japanese government and its nefarious designs to take over the Philippines. And the US military produced and consolidated these suspicions into reports that constructed a racial narrative of US national security. In November of 1907, the Military Intelligence Division, or the MID, authored one of the earliest global surveys of US national security interests. It dwelled on threats posed by Asians and Japan in particular. Completely disregarding Filipino grievances against US colonial rule, the report fixated on Japan's racial and imperial ambitions. So that report stated Japan, quote, "Japan has for many years desired to unite the people of Asia with herself as the dominant and controlling power. She believes that she has a heaven-sent mission to control the affairs of the extreme Orient, and all her efforts have been directed to this end for a long time back," unquote. Even as US officials projected and fixated on Japan's growing influence, it was Filipinos mobilizing against the US empire that provided the evidence of that influence. So many anti-colonial revolutionaries in Asia and around the world really did indeed look to Japan for inspiration. And they often romanticized Japan as a role model against the West. A revolutionary newspaper in the Philippines argued in 1908, quote, "Filipinos, we do not want Japan as a ruler. Nevertheless, we want her as a leader, as a redeemer, as a guide, as breath to the existence of the nations of the Orient and of a people gathered under the same name and united by ties of fraternity and of blood more or less strong," unquote. So rather than listening to Filipinos' desires, demands for independence, US officials looked for signs of Imperial Japan at work. And Bandholz came to be sure of it, that it was all a Japanese conspiracy. He responded to that particular newspaper editorial by writing, quote, "I have no proof, but I am convinced that the Japanese government owns or at least controls that paper," unquote. Fueled by Filipino revolutionaries and agents of the US colonial security state, rumors of an impending war between the United States and Japan ultimately bore witness to the US empire's insecurities. Bandholz was alarmed enough to write directly to the White House, although he tried not to sound too alarmed. He wrote, quote, "I don't want you to think I'm a historical old maid, nor that we are all rattled over the situation. Some of these little people can no more help conspiring than they can help fighting cocks. We are obliged to consider both as objectionable, but we should take neither too seriously," unquote. Now, as the anti-colonial movement in the Philippines gained momentum, US authorities kept a close eye on De Los Reyes and other revolutionaries. They deemed, and this is in one of the constabulary reports, anti-American and pro-Japanese. So to be an anti-American was defined as pro-Japanese. And when De Los Reyes left for Japan in the beginning of 1910, ostensibly to get the Bible translated and published, rumors of his collaboration with Japanese authorities distressed US officials in the Philippines. De Los Reyes was busy in Japan, according to constabulary informants. He was making arrangements for the shipment of arms, money, and revolutionary pamphlets written by Spanish anarchists, according to constabulary reports. If the widespread desire and demand for Philippine independence unnerved US authorities, the specter of anarchism and socialism taking root in the Philippines deepened their fears. A constabulary informant related that upon De Los Reyes' return from Japan back to the Philippines, he was planning to launch a socialist party in the Philippines. And that report concluded, quote, "It is believed, and with reason, that if such socialist party is formed, it will be truly formidable. Socialistic ideas are rooted here in popular sentiment," unquote. For the US colonial security state struggles for independence, defined as sedition, revolution, that is anarchism or socialism, and Japanese alliance or Pan-Asian solidarity came to be interpreted as one and the same. To support one was to support the other, and all of those alliances and activities demanded more agents, more resources. And that was the logic of empire and national security. De Los Reyes, for his part, saw through the bloody mess that marked the beginnings of the US national security as we know it today. When he returned to the Philippines in the fall of 1910, De Los Reyes began meeting with those he had worked with to form the UOD. At one particular meeting, closely monitored by the constabulary, he reportedly told his collaborators, his colleagues, quote, "Up to the present, the agents of the government have accomplished nothing in their investigations. They hear noises but do not know where they come from. I myself, whom the Americans consider an irresponsible man, incapable of this kind of work, am constantly playing tricks on them. And when they talk with me, they get nothing out of me, while I, with my insidious and seemingly innocent questions, learn from them whatever I choose," unquote. Now, De los Reyes knew that his remarks were being monitored, and he wanted US officials to know that he was not intimidated. Recalling his lessons on anarchism, he called on Filipino workers to rise, to organize. He reportedly said, quote, "Until the laborers keep their strikes up to the end, following the proceedings of educated workers and responsible socialists, nothing good can come to them. Until the first bomb has been exploded, they will not think of listening to the poor. Until they make themselves feared through violence, they will be considered as ridiculous beings and peaceful lunatics." If anything, De los Reyes was engaging the US security state by mocking its futility and its insecurity. Later, a constabulary agent followed De los Reyes to a newspaper office and recorded what happened. The agent reported, quote, "An associate entered and said, 'Hello, Japanese,' at which they all burst out laughing," unquote. The vast Japanese conspiracy was on one level, one big joke on Uncle Sam. In the meantime, US authorities also watched Ricarte's activities. Ricarte finally won his release from prison in 1910. US officials promptly took him to the Manila Custom House and ordered him again to pledge allegiance to the United States. When he refused, he was placed on a ship bound to Hong Kong. And the head of the constabulary's information division became convinced that he will eventually go to Japan. He argued, the agent argued, and there is no doubt that united with the elements already in Japan and Hong Kong, and with those who will join them, they will form a nucleus which will engage in arousing the minds of people here and in pushing them toward a revolution. Now, Ricarte, for his part, had begun looking more and more toward a potential alliance with Japan. He explained in a letter intercepted by the constabulary, he wrote, quote, "I esteem the Japanese as friends and allies, but as dominators, never. Japan, by her admirable victories over Russia, is the first Oriental nation which has dignified the Orientals," unquote. In the context of rising tensions between the United States and Japan, he argued the Filipinos had no choice but to side with Japan and get rid of the US colonial presence in the Philippines. And tracking Ricarte's revolutionary movements in turn entrenched the US colonial security state in the Philippines and far beyond. The constabulary sent a secret agent to Hong Kong to keep tabs on Ricarte's anti-colonial activities. And as the US security regime extended its reach to prevent an anti-colonial revolution, its accesses ironically mobilized Filipinos, pushing them to welcome a war between the United States and Japan and to extol Ricarte and Japan as beacons of freedom. So in working class neighborhoods of Manila, a secret agent reported that the quote, residents hoped the Japanese would come at once to root up the abuses of the Americans who disturb even the women who have done nothing but protect our interests, unquote. And so the widespread surveillance of anyone possibly affiliated with Japan and Ricarte generated more surveillance, which simultaneously uncovered and generated new revolutionary schemes. And the popular rejection of US colonialism was really widespread across the Philippines and very ordinary. So at a movie theater appropriately titled, named Empire, a constabulary officer wrote, "The American flag was hissed at loudly by the audience," unquote, when the image of the Stars and Stripes appeared in the movie theater. So under the cover of darkness, Filipinos expressed their solidarity and anti-colonial rage. And although the police were notified in many instances, the US security regime could do nothing but to remark on the event's ordinary nature. Upon receiving that particular report, Bandholz, the chief of the constabulary, simply scribbled in the margins of that report that he had seen the same thing at a different movie theater. Ricarte dreamed of an independent Philippines, and he said that he would call it the Rizzaline Island, named after Jose Rizal, and he would include Guam in that political formation. And on Christmas Eve, 1914, his supporters in Manila tried to organize an armed uprising, but the constabulary was ready. The constabulary, the MID, and the Manila police quickly shut down that violent uprising in Manila in 1914. Fed up with Ricarte's movements and pronouncements, US officials pressured British authorities to expel Ricarte from Hong Kong when World War I broke out. In the spring of 1915, constabulary agents followed Ricarte to Shanghai and arrested him. They were going to bring him back to Manila. But Ricarte ran away in Hong Kong. His wife, Agueda Esteban, who was a revolutionary in her own right, she had been waging war against Spain and the United States as well. Esteban secured a passage to Japan for herself and Ricarte. And the couple lived in exile in Japan for the next 3 decades. In the last years of Ricarte's life, he briefly returned to the spotlight. Soon after Japanese forces attacked Hawaii and the Philippines in December of 1941, he agreed to return home to the Philippines aboard a Japanese military plane. He was 75 years old by then. And when he landed in the Philippines, Ricarte helped to raise the Japanese flag in the Philippines and delivered a speech advising Filipinos to cooperate with the Japanese, their liberators, he said. And Ricarte would work to justify Japanese occupation of the Philippines before passing away in July of 1945. Ricarte never pledged allegiance to the United States, but his tragic ending nonetheless acceded to the racial and colonial order that he spent his lifetime trying to overthrow. So in the decades after the Philippine-American War, Japan was like the United States in 1898. It was more of a symbol of new possibilities than a revolutionary force. And during the Japanese occupation of the Philippines, more than 4 decades later, Japan and the United States apparently changed places, with the United States cast again as a possible means toward anti-colonial liberation. In the end, though, the contradiction was never between the United States and Japan. It was ultimately between empire and democracy. In embracing Japan, just as if he had embraced the United States, Ricarte served to advance empire. And democracy had to wait in the Philippines and beyond. As Filipino workers moved to Hawaii and the US metropole in the 1910s and 20s, so did the US security state. Both Filipino workers and agents of the US state carried with them histories and memories of what had preceded them. And wherever the Japanese and Filipinos converged, physically, ideologically, symbolically, and otherwise, agents of the US state came to see a pan-Asian conspiracy to undermine and overthrow the US empire. When Hawaii's sugar planters faced a massive strike by Japanese plantation workers in 1909, they began recruiting Filipino workers. So within a span of 10 years, Filipino workers went from 0.3% of the plantation labor force in Hawaii to about 25%. But that movement of workers created new anxieties, new possibilities. And in 1920, when Japanese and Filipino workers both went out on strike, the MID interpreted it as something more insidious, something bigger. So the MID agent in Hawaii reported on the strike, quote, "This may be a case of labor against capital, but it sounds more like a declaration of final racial allegiance. It is a reflection of pan-Asianism." Over time, this agent grew more certain of its racial foundation. He concluded, quote, "The Japanese government is behind this movement in order to weld together and to whip into line the Oriental population of this territory in the furtherance of his pan-Asian policies. We have, in other words, a powerful, potential, and mass enemy in our midst." Now, Japanese workers tried to counter such reports by stating again and again that they had no affiliation with the Japanese government, and they did not. But the racial and counter-revolutionary narrative of US national security ran too deep. So 3 months after the conclusion of the 1920 labor strike, the MID officer in Honolulu decided to write a comprehensive report on the Japanese situation in Hawaii and around the world. And this is what the agent wrote from Honolulu. Quote, "Japan is firmly based in Formosa, or Taiwan now, close to the Philippines. She has, by her propaganda in the Philippines, rendered possible insurrections on a small scale. She is undoubtedly plotting with the Germans in Mexico. She controls the lanes of the Pacific from Hawaii to the Orient. She has extended her espionage net from the Puget Sound to Panama." The agent's apocalyptic vision went on and on, so much so that his superiors noted that the report was, quote, "a peculiar paper for an official document. It reads more like a piece of propaganda," unquote. But his report was merely an uncensored version of intelligence reports emanating from the Philippines since 1907, if not earlier. Concentrating on the Japanese problem not only enabled the great expansion of the US security state, but it also served to elide the ultimate source behind labor and political struggles in the Philippines and in Hawaii, the US empire. So let me wrap up by going back to where I began. It was no accident that the FBI's first reference to Bulasan emerged during World War II in an investigation into Socialista supporters in the United States for their supposedly pro-Japanese views. In the Philippines, the Constabulary had monitored the Socialista movement in the 1930s for their reputed alliance with Japan and their communist ties and proclivities. The movement that increasingly captured Bulasan's attention and his imagination was the Hukbalahap, a rebellion in the Philippines. And on December 1st, 1949, Bulasan wrote a letter to Luis Taruk, the leader of the Huk movement in the Philippines. The letter had been discovered in the possession of the #1 Filipino communist, the FBI wrote, and the FBI got that report from Bulasan's letter from the National Bureau of Investigation in the Philippines, an agency set up when the Philippines was granted independence from the US Empire in 1946. The Philippines Bureau forwarded Bulasan's letter to the FBI. In that letter, Bulasan told Taruk that he was working on a fictional account of Taruk's life and the peasant movement, and that he hoped to make that novel into a Hollywood film once, quote, the sudden resurgence of fascist activities here died down. Bulasan knew that the US government was after him, but he longed for a different time, a different place. He wrote to Taruk, quote, I can't leave the United States now because I will never be able to come back if I do. I think you know the reasons why. I will be there someday soon to work with you. I am playing with time. He concluded that letter by writing, quote, I'm a very small man, only 5 feet and 2 inches, and I weigh not even 100 pounds, but if there is anything I can do for you and your movement, if it is only the use of my name, please feel free to do so. I am not afraid of the fascist bastards at home, unquote. Over Bulasan's lifetime, US colonialism in the Philippines had given birth to a vast security regime, the roots of a national security state fixated on suppressing sedition and revolution. On the other side of the Pacific, Bulasan came face to face with that vast security state. In June of 1954, after another long stay at a sanitarium for tuberculosis, Bulasan requested an interview with the FBI to try to clear his name. In a parked car in Seattle, Bulasan talked with several FBI agents about his personal history. He said that he had become interested in the Huk movement during World War II, quote, because it represented a movement on behalf of the people instead of the rich landowners. And he denied membership in the Communist Party. When asked by FBI agents how he could deny following the CP line when his writings always followed that line, Bulasan reportedly, according to the FBI, shrugged his shoulders and displayed no interest in answering that or any specific questions concerning communism. 3 months later, J. Edgar Hoover forwarded Bulasan's file to the Department of Justice for possible deportation, and Bulasan would die in Seattle 2 years later in 1956. That Bulasan died so young was tragic, but let me end on a very hopeful note. One of the very last items, in fact, it's the very last item in his FBI file, was from November 1959, more than 3 years after his death. A confidential informant told the FBI that Filipino labor leaders who had traveled to the United States the previous summer on US government funds, no less, were returning to the Philippines radicalized. After visits to the United States, the informant stated, quote, certain Philippine labor leaders changed their way of thinking and become anti-American, unquote. The informant couldn't provide many specifics, but he specifically identified Carlos Bulasan as one such person in contact with these converted left-wing labor leaders. From his grave in Seattle, Bulosan was apparently radicalizing Filipino labor leaders into seditious subjects. And there was nothing the FBI could do about it except to place that information in Bulosan's FBI file. That to me was a fitting coda, a metaphor for the US empire. The US state's claims to security and sovereignty were always greater than its capacity to kill revolutionary struggles for freedom and democracy. That should give us cause for alarm and hope. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I know that was so fascinating and interesting in so many ways. I think we are now taking some questions. I know that my students have some questions prepared for you, but I wanted to begin by asking a question about some of the relationships that you think about, the political relationships that you think about in the book. I was thinking particularly about how, while the argument that communism and Marxism served as tools for global anti-colonial critique is familiar to many, your book makes the intervention that anarchist philosophy may have a deep relationship with deep colonial movements in Asia and potentially elsewhere. I was wondering if you could say more about this under-theorized relationship and how you came to think of their formations together.
Yeah, it really was through tracing De los Reyes's thoughts and movements that I came to that realization. Because when he was imprisoned in Barcelona, he was there with other anti-colonial revolutionaries, and some of them were from Catalan, and they were, and anarchism had deep roots in Spain and in Southern Europe in particular. And Benedict Anderson in his book Under Three Flags was very suggestive of those connections, but it was also through looking at US laws on immigration that I came to see those connections, right? And in the book, I think it's in the acknowledgements actually, I talk about how I came to this project originally because I couldn't figure out why the US immigration system targeted Asians and radicals in the first 3 decades of the 20th century. Like everybody kind of knows about that. So you have the Anarchist Exclusion Act of 1903. But it just seemed to me that there had to be some kind of an explanation, a connection there. So by looking at the genealogy of US immigration laws, you can really begin to see how anarchism, sedition, and anti-colonial activities really came together, especially through the US state. So I guess it's through multiple levels. It's by looking at these anti-colonial activists and by looking at the documents of the US state that you can really begin to see those connections. And I think people tend to forget how much anarchism haunted radical activists, before the Red Scare, right? So it was anarchism that really animated. So Theodore Roosevelt talked about a global war against anarchism, right? And that was at the turn of the 20th century.
Yeah, thank you. And I think relatedly, throughout your book, you interweave poetry and plays into your examination of US ideology and also your examination of anti-colonial movements. And I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about your research process, but also how you navigate between mediums as a historian.
Yeah, no, I mean, I wanted to do more, but at the same time, I do engage the discipline of history, so I felt I need to be legible in that discipline as well. But it's really, and it's really thinking with people like Lisa Lowe that really helped me to figure out what I wanted to say in the first place. But I think maybe that might be a question about the play that I talk about maybe in the first chapter. And that play came to me, right? It was in the archive. I didn't know what to do with it. It was just in the National Archives. It was a fascinating play, but I couldn't make sense of it. I knew the White House had received that play by this Filipino who was actually working with the US colonial regime in the Philippines, but there was a really subversive reading where I could see a subversive reading of that play. So that helped me to figure out what that playwright could have been talking about. And there were all these seditious plays throughout the Philippines during the early years of US colonial occupation of the Philippines. So in a sense, I followed the documents, but I also realized that, I know there are limits to the colonial archive at the same time. And so I don't know if I have a particular methodology. In a way, I'm kind of a conventional historian in that I dig through the archives like crazy, but at the same time, I know we have to step away and engage in other kinds of disciplines and be deeply critical of that archival process at the same time. But really, the archives reveal a lot, right? Because that's where the documents are on one level, but it's also an institution that largely justified and perpetuated and continues to perpetuate the US empire at the same time. And so we have to be very critical of everything that we read, but there's so much there, right? So this narrative of Filipinos working with the Japanese, I came to that realization through the archives because these files on Japanese and Filipino workers working together in Hawaii, those were filed right next to these documents, about how Japanese and Filipinos were working together in the Philippines. I forget the original question now, but I hope.
No, thank you. I have like a few more questions, but I'll ask one more and then move into the student questions that I know we have and some audience questions.
Okay.
I did want to ask you about your introductory remarks where you rightfully claim that the US state has been and remains the largest perpetrator of anti-Asian violence. But this is not how anti-Asian violence is currently narrated. And I was wondering if you could expand on your thoughts on this, particularly the ways in which state violence becomes narrated as individual acts of exceptional violence.
Yeah, no, and I realize that people are searching for answers. They want to hold the individuals committing these horrific acts accountable. And I realize that impulse, but I think there is a larger political, cultural context to that anti-Asian sentiment, hatred, and violence. Like where do these sentiments come from? Where do they percolate? Like how are they justified? And to me, you cannot understand anti-Asian violence, anti-Asian rhetoric outside of US wars in Asia. We are talking about the killing of millions of people, right? And I think we need to be talking about the Philippine-American War, the Korean War, the Vietnam War, as really genocidal wars. And I'm not saying that we should apply that term to every war, but we are talking about a scale of violence that's really hard to imagine, right? And, we're coming on the anniversary of the shootings in Atlanta. Like, how does that the US military's role in producing and maintaining a racialized and sexualized military economy in Korea? Like, how does that get transferred to these massage parlors in Atlanta? I think those are the kinds of questions that we need to be thinking about, right? And all of that can be traced, you know, at least back to the Korean War, if not before that.
Thank you. So this is a student question, a question by Raya. And so she writes, and this is like in thinking about your book, what happens when we liken the US government to the absolute ruler? More specifically, how do the practices of anarchy you've mentioned in the book work to dismantle the absolute power concentrated within US democracy? I think we were all sort of really captivated by your description that oftentimes the US nation state is not called imperial. And the students were really grappling with like what happens when we say the US is an imperial state and call the US government an absolute ruler.
Yeah, no, I mean, you know, I tell my students, once you begin to see the US empire, and I think you captured that beautifully in your introduction, like once you begin to see it, you can't unsee it, right? It's everywhere. It's in Seattle, it's in Boston, like you just can't avoid it. And, and you know, I'm gonna quote myself from the book, okay, but, and it was something that I wanted to include in my talk, but I couldn't quite get it in there. But it's toward the very end of the book, I write, I feel kind of silly quoting myself, but please bear with me. To point out the obvious, a democracy rooted in empire and white supremacy is not democracy. That's American democracy, right? And I end the book by noting that you can't have empire and democracy. They cannot coexist, right? And for me, we need to be talking about the United States for what it's always been and what it continues to be. And that is an empire rooted in white supremacy. And that is just where I begin. I don't think you can talk about US history outside of that context. And then once you begin to see that, I think things begin to make sense. But I really think that is where we need to begin. Now, having said that, it's a very fragile formation. It's obviously rooted in, you know, racism, which we can critique, and it's a fragile formation that's always being critiqued, and that is why it needs a security state always to justify it, to secure that imperial formation. So I think it is this force that we need to contend with. It's very violent, it's pervasive, but we also need to recognize that it's a very fragile formation at the same time, right? And the house of cards that is the US empire needs to be deconstructed, right? And that is what we need to do.
Yeah, in thinking about this deconstruction, a student, Jessica, was thinking about the epigraph that you begin with of Alex Hing's, but that you also read today, and was asking a question around Hing's formation of Asian American Revolution, but also Yuri Kochiyama's alternative meetings of Asian American identity. So I'm reading her question. She writes, how can we reckon with Jung's your original statement that Hing claimed a revolutionary Pan-Asian identity that goes beyond the nation that gave birth to ethnic and Asian American studies? If constructing this kind of identity means breaking boundaries, does it also mean to reject the nation that served as the site for revolution? And I think that part of the question is really grappling with, I know that the students and I've been really grappling with the ways in which the term Asian American is currently depoliticized, and the way, and your book politicizes the term Pan-Asian. So we were hoping you can kind of talk us through your thoughts on the terminology.
Yeah, no, I mean, Alex Singh's quote is from 1970 during the height of the Asian American movement. So it's quite, it's outside of the focus of the book. But at the same time, it really kind of captured at least what the US state considered to be a revolutionary formation, a Pan-Asian formation, somehow always connected to Imperial Japan in weird and ironic and contradictory ways. But I do think a lot of anti-colonial activists really embrace that idea of a Pan-Asian political formation against empire. So that included Gadar activists, and it definitely included, Filipino revolutionaries fighting against the U.S. empire. It definitely shaped the communist movement in the 1920s and 1930s. And so I think the book in a way is a challenge for us to think about this Pan-Asian formation before the Asian American movement of the 1960s and 1970s. But as I point out, I think and you alluded to this when you asked the question, I think the category Asian American has lost its radical origins, its radical meanings now. I think the idea of a Pan-Asian anti-colonial formation as a revolutionary force really stopped being a radical critique with the Popular Front, with Imperial Japan co-opting that idea of Pan-Asian identity, right? And so I think maybe this is what the student is getting at, is we need to be very mindful of the kinds of identities, collective identities that we invoke and toward what ends, right? And so in 1970, when Alex Singh was writing, Asian American could have that radical possibility. Is that still the case today? Maybe. Maybe it could be used as an effective means to contest and challenge anti-Asian violence, but I think we need to be aware of of why we are deploying that term and toward what ends, right? Because I think it is used in very descriptive ways, and I think it's it applies to the field of Asian American studies, Asian American history, right? What do I mean by that? Well, there's so many texts out there that really promote the idea of Asians as immigrants, the United States as the nation of immigrants, and it's about recognition by fellow Americans, if not in the past, then in the present, as full-fledged Americans, as if that will liberate us somehow. So in other words, it's for many within ethnic studies and Asian American studies, it's become a liberal project. And I think that's toxic. I think that's self-defeating. And we need to challenge that as much as possible.
Yes, absolutely. I think we're nearing the end of the Q&A, but there are two more questions, so I'm going to sort of blend them together. And it's actually, it continues to be about kind of your thoughts around anarchism and movements, anti-colonial movements. So this is a question by the student Robert. He asks, using the description of anarchism provided by De Los Rios, Anarchism seems like an ideology made to break links and undo the abstractions created by laws and the colonial state. In a sense, the Filipino anarchist is a source of great anti-colonial power. And even so, the US still manages to weave its own stories of national security, defining anarchy as chaos and the Philippines as savage. Is there any concept which the imperial machine cannot abstract and exploit? How much power do our stories really have if even the most heterotopic nations and ideologies fall victim to its abstraction? So that's like part one of the question. And then Harrison was thinking, once again, kind of circling back to the repression of anti-imperial anarchist movements in the Philippines and also Spain. And he writes, it is still the case that we are required to swear by the ideology of imperialism. For example, in Texas, teachers are required to sign pro-Israel oaths that stipulate they will never boycott the country in order to work. What is the thorough line between political repression of anarchists by the US in the 20th century versus how repression of anti-imperial politics functions today and now?
All right, those are big questions. I think I'll just riff on them a little bit, partly because I'm getting tired. I think it's how we reckon with the past, on what terms, how we decide to frame the past that is going to be crucial to how we confront empire, how we can create new terms, categories that can be critical of that imperial formation. I mean, in a way, we have to engage the US state, the liberal state, but that doesn't mean we need to be co-opted by it, right? So, toward the end of the book, I talk a lot about the communist movement in the Philippines. And I think the communist movement was a force to be reckoned with, but at the same time, they struggle with, like, how can you criticize people like, Quezon, who was so complicit in the US colonial regime in the Philippines? So they were deeply critical, but then they became to be criminalized. They had to go underground. But when they reemerged in 1938, and they decided to work with Quezon, but at that time, at that particular moment, then they decided that they were going to be anti-fascist first and foremost, and therefore they had to ally themselves with the United States, right, which they called a democracy. Another person that I write about in the conclusion is Carl Jonetta, an Asian American, Japanese American communist. He was very much involved in the labor movement up and down the West Coast, just like Carlos Bulosan. But then he was so against Imperial Japan, was so anti-fascist, wanted to follow the CP line as much as possible, that during World War II, he became an informant on fellow Japanese in the concentration camps set up by the US state, even as the US state continued to monitor his subversive activities in Manzanar. It's so ridiculous, but he really came to embrace American nationalism during World War II. We don't want to be falling into those traps. And so it's getting at the first question, I guess, is how do we do it? Well, I think we have to use our imagination. I think we have to use irony, right? I tell my students, whenever Asian American activists deployed, US nationalism, I can always hear an ironic undertone, right? And And I think that's how we need to deploy it, right? Deploy that nationalist discourse, right? So that we become somewhat legible, but also illegible at the same time, right? So that we're always exceeding the bounds of empire, critiquing it, engaging the liberal state, because really you can't not engage the liberal state, I don't think. But at the same time, be ironic and always be mindful of the larger context, the larger goals that we are striving for. And it definitely is not, at least in my mind, being recognized as full-fledged Americans. Number one, I think that is an impossibility. And number two, why would you ever want to appeal to be part of this racial and colonial order called the United States of America? That's just something that to be very blunt. But this might get posted on YouTube, so let me just say here, I am a loyal American. Okay. As we all are, correct?
That seems like the perfect place for us to sort of ironically turn away from you and to Philip Tai. Thank you so much, Muno. That was such an amazing talk.
Thank you.
Philip, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, everyone, for that very thoughtful conversation. Thank you again, Professor Moon. Thank you again, Professor Kim. And finally, thank you to the audience for your time and interest. I do apologize for the lack of time getting to some of the questions, so we appreciate your understanding. Mika Morikawa-Jo will make one final announcement, but let me make one last comment. I want to use this occasion for the final speaker series event to thank all of you, thank the audience for attending this series. The series was conceived last spring at the height of anti-Asian violence and bigotry, and sadly, judging from...
All right, sorry folks. This is Mika Morikawa-Jo. We unfortunately lost audio from Dr. Tai at the last minute. I'm sure he had some things to say, and Dr. Tai, please feel free to send it to me in the chat if you would like me to say it out loud. But meanwhile, please allow me to make a quick announcement regarding this event. First of all, thank you from me as well to everybody for coming and joining us today, asking such thought-provoking questions and showing up to show how important the speaker series is to our university. Right in the chat very shortly, someone is going to be posting a feedback survey on this event. And for those folks who fill it out, you will get a chance to be entered into a book raffle for this event. The book raffle for which we are talking about today, the book Menace to Empire by Dr. Moon Ho Jung, who spoke with us today. So please, please, please fill out the survey form for a chance to get a free book sent to you from the Asian Studies program. Dr. Tai says, sorry to everyone that this has happened in the past, and he can't fix it without Zoom crashing, so his sincere apologies. Thank you again, everyone. I'm officially going to close the event. We truly appreciate your time. Dr. Jung, we truly appreciate your time. And Dr. Kim, thank you so much for moderating this event for us. We hope everyone has a great rest of their evening. Thank you.